Picture a European palace exactly the way film and television usually present it. A lord and his family seated for dinner in a grand hall lit by dozens of candles, servants moving quietly in matching clothes, everyone comfortable in the room even though it is the middle of winter. Very little of that picture holds up against the historical record. A European palace of roughly 1,000 years ago was built first for defense and administration, and only second for comfort. And whatever comfort existed had to be produced fresh every single day through a large amount of physical labor. The stone walls that made a palace look permanent and secure also made it cold, damp, and genuinely difficult to heat with any evenness. The lord who appeared to command everyone around him usually had almost no privacy from his own household, since the room where he ate, held court, and often slept was also the room where dozens of other people lived, worked, and slept alongside him. The carefully managed dining, dressing, and entertaining that outside visitors actually witnessed depended on strict, unglamorous systems of labor that those same visitors never saw. This is what daily life actually involved inside a European palace around the year 1000. How the building itself worked, who ran it, how people stayed warm, how they ate, how they dressed, how they welcomed guests, and how they slept behind walls that were built, first and foremost, to keep enemies out. The center of almost every palace from this period was a single room known as the hall. It was built as a rectangle, typically 1.5 to 3 times longer than it was wide, and taller than it was wide as well, which gave it a scale unlike almost any other room most people of the period would ever enter. In the earliest halls of this era, the fire that heated the room sat in the middle of the floor rather than against a wall, and smoke found its way out through a hole in the roof or through a small lantern-like structure called a louve, which could be opened or closed with a cord depending on the wind. Everyone attached to the household ate together in this room, and at night many of the lower-ranking members of that household, along with any guest who lacked a private chamber, simply lay down on its floor to sleep. At one end stood a raised platform called a dais, where the lord and his family sat at what was known as the high table, positioned so the entire hall could see them. The rest of the room filled with long tables arranged strictly by rank, so that where a person sat was a public, immediately visible statement of their standing in the household. Some of the best documented examples of this exact arrangement, from exactly this period, come from Anglo-Saxon and early Norman England, where kings maintained a network of royal halls at sites including Cheddar, Winchester, and Westminster. The Bayeux Tapestry, embroidered not long after these events, even shows the English nobleman Harold Godwinson feasting in his own hall shortly before the events of 1066. Running a palace of this scale required a full staff of officers, each responsible for a clearly defined area. At the top of that domestic hierarchy stood the steward, sometimes called a seneschal, who managed the household's finances, kept the accounts, collected rents, and made sure supplies never ran short. Roughly equal to the steward in authority was the marshal, who controlled the stables and horses, and was also responsible for discipline among the staff. The chamberlain managed the lord's private living quarters and personal comfort, which put him in closer daily contact with the lord than almost anyone else and made him a frequent advisor on sensitive matters. A separate officer, the master of the wardrobe, was responsible for clothing and household textiles, including the uniforms, called livery, worn by the lord's own servants. In royal households specifically, these same titles carried real political power well beyond domestic management, and even a role as small as arranging a single banquet or carrying the king's cup at dinner could become a formal, sometimes inherited honor. A large palace could employ 50 or more people at once, including cooks, grooms, carpenters, masons, falconers, and musicians, in addition to armed men who served the household militarily. Skilled officers such as the steward and the marshal were typically paid an annual wage and sometimes granted land for long service, while the lowest-ranked servants were paid by the day and could be dismissed with little notice whenever the lord traveled elsewhere. Keeping any of this warm through a European winter was a problem nobody in this period ever fully solved. Stone, the material that made a palace look strong from the outside, is a poor insulator. It draws heat out of a room and tends to release moisture in cold weather, which is part of why so many surviving descriptions of palace life mention damp air alongside the cold. Over the centuries that followed the start of this period, the central hearth in the hall gradually moved toward the wall, first gaining a stone hood to direct smoke more effectively, and eventually, by around the 12th and 13th centuries, becoming an enclosed fireplace connected to a proper chimney flue built into the wall. Before that shift was complete, most rooms outside the hall itself had no fire at all, and a warmed room, such as a private chamber with its own hearth, was itself a mark of rank, rather than something every member of the household could expect. Heavy woven tapestries were hung on interior walls, not primarily for decoration, but to create a layer of trapped air between the cold stone and the room, which held in warmth from whatever fire happened to be burning nearby. Wealthier households added fur linings behind the tapestries for extra insulation, then took the entire arrangement down and stored it once the weather turned warm. In rooms too far from any fireplace, portable braziers, metal containers filled with hot coals or charcoal embers, were carried from room to room as needed. At night, beds built for the lord, the lady, and the most important guests came fitted with heavy curtains that could be drawn shut around the sleeping person, trapping body heat inside a small enclosed space that no fireplace alone could have managed for an entire room. Feeding a household this size required a kitchen organized entirely around volume. Kitchens were usually placed apart from the hall and the family's living quarters, sometimes in a separate building entirely, both to keep smoke and noise away from the residential parts of the palace, and to reduce the risk of a kitchen fire spreading further. At the center of the kitchen was an open hearth, in some surviving examples, large enough for a person to walk directly into, built to run more or less continuously rather than being lit fresh for each meal. Large cauldrons made of iron, bronze, or copper, hung from chains or hooks above the fire and handled boiling and stewing, the most common method for feeding large numbers of people at once. Roasting, reserved mainly for wealthier households, required a long metal or wooden spit turned by hand for hours at a stretch, a task usually given to the youngest and lowest-ranked kitchen staff, who also had to keep basting the meat so it did not dry out over the open flame. Bread ovens built of stone or brick handled the daily baking, and in some of the largest palace kitchens, these ovens were reportedly large enough to fit an entire animal carcass. For a major feast, even a well-equipped kitchen was not enough, and additional fires were built outdoors, with whole animals turned on spits over open flames in the yard, while the main kitchen continued working at full capacity indoors. The kitchen itself had its own internal hierarchy. A master cook at the top, sometimes ranked close to a minor nobleman in status, followed by specialist cooks assigned to roasting, sauces, or pastry, with kitchen boys, often local village children working in exchange for food, handling the hardest and dirtiest labor at the bottom. Because the kitchen connected to the hall through discrete corridors built specifically for that purpose, most nobles and their guests rarely saw the people responsible for the food placed in front of them. Sanitation inside a stone palace followed a fairly consistent design across the period. A small chamber called a garderobe, built directly into the thickness of an outer wall, with a wooden bench seat covering a shaft that dropped waste outside the building entirely, into a moat, a river, a designated pit, or occasionally straight off a cliff face where the terrain allowed it. The word garderobe originally described a small storage room for valuable clothing, and the two meanings overlapped for a practical reason. The toilet chamber and the clothes closet were frequently the same small space attached to a bedroom. Hay, dried grass, or moss served the function paper serves today. A private garderobe attached directly to a bedroom was a genuine mark of status. The lord's own chamber and the palace priest's quarters were the most likely to have one, while most of the household shared communal facilities, and everyone, including the lord himself, kept a chamber pot for use at night. Clearing the base of these shafts was dangerous, unpleasant work, usually assigned to lower-ranked servants who had to reach awkward, often slippery positions near the base of a tower to do it. Bathing itself followed a pattern quite different from its popular reputation. Nobility in this period bathed with real regularity, not daily, but commonly on a weekly basis, or more often in warmer months, using a large wooden tub that servants filled by hand with water heated in the kitchen. Herbs such as lavender, chamomile, mint, or rose petals were often added, because heating enough water for a full bath demanded significant fuel and labor. It made more practical sense as a periodic event than a daily one, and some lords even traveled with their own portable bathtub rather than risk finding no bathing facilities at their destination. Washing hands before and after meals, by contrast, was expected constantly and without exception, since most people ate directly with their hands and a shared knife. Once the sun went down, a medieval palace was considerably darker than most modern depictions suggest. The main source of everyday light was the tallow candle, made from rendered animal fat, inexpensive but burning with visible smoke and a strong smell. Wealthy households and churches used beeswax candles whenever they could instead, since beeswax burned cleaner, brighter, and without the smell of tallow, though it was expensive enough that it was sometimes imported from as far away as Eastern Europe. Rushlights, made by dipping the dried peeled stem of a rush plant in animal fat, offered a cheaper option that burned for roughly half an hour before needing to be replaced. Simple oil lamps, hung from the ceiling or fixed to a wall, provided another option, particularly in larger rooms such as the hall. What all of these light sources had in common was that they were limited and largely portable rather than fixed and constant. A palace corridor was not kept continuously lit through the night, and torches mounted on wall brackets were typically stored there unlit, ready to be taken down and lit by anyone about to head outside, rather than being kept burning around the clock. Most people simply carried a candle, a rushlight, or a small lantern with them as they moved from room to room after dark. Floors throughout the palace, including the hall itself, were commonly covered in loose rushes, reeds, or straw rather than left bare, both for warmth underfoot and to give the room some cushioning and a place to absorb spilled food or drink. This floor covering was not something replaced daily or even weekly. Many households cleared it out and laid down a fresh layer only once or twice a year. Between changes, fragrant herbs were scattered on top of the old rushes, specifically to counteract the smell that built up over months of use, releasing their scent whenever someone walked across the floor, and some of these herbs had the added benefit of discouraging insects. Wealthier households employed a servant specifically responsible for keeping the chambers supplied with fresh rushes, a role that appears in surviving household records under the literal title of rush strewer. Only later in the medieval period did tile and plaster floors become standard in the wealthiest homes, which means that for a long stretch of this era, the floor a lord walked across every day was, quite literally, a layer of dried plant material that needed periodic replacing like any other household supply. Getting dressed at the start of the period covered here followed a fairly consistent layered system for both men and women. Underneath everything came a simple linen undergarment, a chemise or shirt, worn by men and women alike, paired with a form of drawers called brays for men. Over that came one or more tunics, knee-length for men engaged in everyday activity, but ankle-length for upper-class men on formal occasions and for women in general. Legs were covered separately with hose, a fitted cloth leg covering tied below the knee with garters, since trousers in the modern sense did not exist. On top of the tunic came a mantle, essentially a large cloak, fastened with a metal clasp or brooch, typically at the right shoulder for men and at the front or neck for women. None of this was necessarily difficult to put on alone, but the finer versions worn by nobility used costly fabrics such as silk or fine wool, expensive dyes like deep blue or crimson, and fur trim, all of which needed careful handling, and a lord or lady of any real standing had a chamberlain or personal attendant present each morning to help arrange and fasten these layers correctly. Even the household's own servants were dressed with this system in mind. Their livery, the uniform clothing supplied by the lord, was chosen and paid for specifically because visitors judged a household partly by how well turned out its staff appeared, which meant a servant's clothing reflected the lord's status just as directly as the lord's own wardrobe did. A portion of the young people living inside any noble household were not servants in the ordinary sense, but boys sent there specifically to be trained. From around the age of 7, sons of noble families were commonly sent to serve in the household of another lord as a page, a practice that also reinforced alliances and connections between the two families involved. A page's daily duties included serving at table, running errands, carrying messages, and helping with routine tasks like dressing and grooming, while his training covered riding, basic combat, manners, and in some households, reading and writing as well. Around the age of 14, a page who had shown enough ability could be promoted to squire, moving into direct service to a specific knight, managing that knight's horse and equipment, and continuing more advanced training in combat, heraldry, and courtly behavior, all with knighthood as the eventual, though never guaranteed outcome. Pages were also commonly taught music, dancing and hunting, or falconry, skills considered appropriate preparation for a future nobleman rather than simple entertainment. Receiving guests inside a medieval palace operated under expectations treated as seriously as any other household rule. Religious teaching framed hospitality toward travelers as close to a moral obligation, and that expectation extended well beyond monasteries into noble households generally. Refusing shelter to a fellow lord or knight, or allowing harm to come to someone under your roof was considered a serious breach of accepted custom, whatever the personal cost to the host. Despite that obligation, sleeping arrangements for most visitors were far from luxurious. Only the most important guests were given one of the palace's few private chambers. Everyone else, including many knights and lesser nobility, simply laid down on a pallet or a sack on the floor of the great hall once the tables had been cleared for the night. Where a guest sat at the table, however, mattered enormously and was worked out with real care. Seating closer to the high table signaled higher status and closer favor from the host, and getting that placement wrong, seating a rival too close or too far from where custom said they belonged, could create lasting offense between families that had nothing to do with the meal itself. Feast days brought the household's full coordination into public view. Preparing a major banquet involved the steward, the kitchen staff, carvers, and musicians all working from a fixed plan, since a single feast might stretch across many courses served over several hours. The lord and lady sat at the high table on the raised dais so the whole hall could see them, while everyone else sat at long tables arranged strictly by rank. Food was served on trenchers, thick slices of stale bread used in place of plates, which soaked up sauce and meat juices through the meal and were commonly given away afterward as alms to the poor rather than washed and reused. In many households, only the lord and his most honored guest were given a knife by their host. Every other diner was expected to bring one of their own. Spices such as cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and saffron were extremely expensive imports, and hosts served them visibly, on fine dishes, specifically so guests would notice and understand exactly how much wealth the household could afford to display. Wine, particularly spiced wine, carried similar weight, and even the cups used to serve it marked rank within the room, with plain wooden or pewter cups for most of the hall and gilded vessels reserved for the high table. Between courses, musicians, jesters, or other performers filled the pauses in service, making the meal a coordinated hours-long demonstration of exactly how much the host could provide, at least as much as it was a source of nourishment. Once the meal ended and the hall began to empty, the palace shifted into its nighttime routine, still organized around the same fixed sequence of bells used throughout the day. Church and chapel bells marked a set of canonical hours, created originally for religious prayer but used by the entire household, not only the clergy, to track time and structure daily activity, since mechanical clocks did not yet exist in any common form. As night fell, entrances were secured deliberately, portcullises were lowered, gates were barred, and drawbridges were raised where the palace had one, all as part of an ordinary nightly routine, rather than something reserved only for moments of actual danger. Chamber pots, kept in nearly every sleeping space, were used by everyone in the household, including the lord and lady themselves, simply because walking to a garderobe through cold, unlit corridors in the middle of the night was impractical. Lower-ranking members of the household, along with any guest without a private room, settled down to sleep directly on the floor of the great hall once it had been cleared, usually on straw pallets laid over the rushes already covering the floor. Only the lord, the lady, and the most important guests slept in beds fitted with heavy curtains, drawn shut at night specifically to trap body heat in an otherwise cold room, inside a palace that, for all its scale and display during the day, offered very little real warmth or true privacy once the fires burned low. None of this matches the version of medieval palace life shown in most films and television. A palace roughly 1,000 years ago was a working structure first, run by a defined staff of officers, heated through constant and deliberate effort, fed by a kitchen that prepared food in bulk every day, using open fire and manual labor, and secured every night by the same routines used to guard against actual attack. The lord at the center of it lived under nearly as many rules as the servants around him, dressed with help every morning, ate under the same strict hierarchy that governed everyone else at the table, and slept, in the end, inside a cold stone building that no fire, tapestry, or ceremony ever fully warmed. What survives today in ruined walls and restored halls is the visible structure of that life. The daily labor that kept it running, largely unrecorded and mostly unnoticed by the people it served, is the part that is easiest to forget.